Jujutsu Kaisen is one of those anime that doesn't really like to delve into the details. It doesn't do a lot of backstories, it barely explains its own techniques, and God forbid it gets into the lore. But the details it does establish always come back into play. So today we're looking at 13 details that seem to be forgotten by Jujutsu Kaisen, but likely still have a huge role in the story. We'll be starting with the least important details and ending with the most. The first detail comes from the very first episode of the series. Oftentimes in a shonen anime or manga, the message from a family member is a powerful motivator, especially if they're dead. This rings true for Jujutsu Kaisen, as Yuji finds meaning in his grandfather's dying words to save as many people as possible, even if it's just one person. This was Yuji's original motivator and the reason that he became a sorcerer in the first place, but other than that, it hasn't really seemed too prevalent in Yuji's character. We saw it return once after Sukuna's massacre in Shibuya when Yuji wanted to save just one person, but that's kind of it. A lot of times in shonen anime or manga, this kind of motivation is a recurring message the protagonist uses to motivate themselves time and time again. And while Jujutsu Kaisen has gone a little bit off the main path of shonen, I think it's still likely that this message can make a comeback. Considering the stakes of the late game manga, I don't think this kind of mentality is completely out of the question. It could come in the form of saving his colleagues from Sukuna or saving civilians from the merger. This motivation could even be the reason that Yuji saves Megumi if he is the one person that his grandfather mentioned. But we'll be touching on Megumi's rescue a few times throughout this video, so I don't want to spoil all my thoughts on it right now. So instead, let's move on to something that hasn't been mentioned in a while: the prison realm. After being a central motivator and piece of the plot, the prison realm has not been mentioned a single time since Gojo got unsealed, and I think there are two possible reasons for this. First of all, it might have just been outright destroyed by Angel's technique, as Jacob's ladder extinguishes the techniques that it comes in contact with. In her own words, this will kill any incarnated sorcerer and anything evil it is used on. If the prison realm was considered evil, then it was likely destroyed by Angel's technique, but I don't think the prison realm would be considered evil. I mean, it could even be considered good depending on who is inside it. This makes me think that maybe it wasn't destroyed and instead it's going to make a return. In fact, I think trapping Sukuna in the prison realm could be a potential route to defeating him if all else fails. It would take him out of commission for another 1,000 years, which would solve him for this story. There is the obvious issue of the prison realm needing the victim to stand still for 1 minute, but that might not be as much of an issue as it seems. We know that minute must pass in the mind of the victim rather than in their body. Considering Sukuna is considered Megumi in the Culling games, I think that means a minute in Megumi's mind would count for the prison realm as well, especially if Sukuna shifts the burden of the prison realm to him like he did for Infinite Void. We also know Yuji can talk to Megumi via his soul-shaking abilities, so if Yuji triggers a flashback or memory sequence for Megumi that looks over the past year they spent together, the realm could consider Megumi Sukuna and trap both of them in the prison realm. Now obviously this is not a good way to rescue Megumi, as he would be trapped inside the realm as well, and as such I don't think it's likely because it doesn't resolve the plot, but it's still an interesting possibility. The next detail is probably one of my favorite forgotten details: the Cursed Realm, a super obscure, super vague realm that Kenjaku briefly introduced to us as a mean to transport people out of the Culling games. Something named the Cursed Realm feels like it should hold a much bigger significance than it currently does, especially when you realize everything in Jujutsu Kaisen is of course curses. Is this where cursed energy comes from? Is it just a shadowy version of our own world that cursed spirits can't interact with? Why does it seem only Kenjaku knows about it? It feels so important, and yet we know almost nothing about it. Maybe it is way less important than I think it is, and in reality it only exists to save people from the Culling games, but even just telling us that would instantly clear things up. Another major lore bomb that Kenjaku dropped for 1 page and then never brought up again was pure barriers. It was briefly explained that these are the basis of the Culling games barriers, and without them the games would not be able to exist. The very first time I saw these barriers, I thought they would be the key to ending the Culling games. Obviously, I was not correct, as the only way to end the Culling games is for there to be one sorcerer left or for the merger to start, but I still feel like they could be important. This kind of barrier feels like such a huge deal, as they are imperative to the management of cursed spirits, so even something like the merger might still rely on them for power. I think it's possible that if the merger monster is created, which it probably will be, destabilizing the pure barriers could be a key part in weakening the monster so that it can be defeated by the protagonists. The locations of the pure barriers also seem super significant, so I really have no doubt that these will be coming back into play soon. Also, a bit off topic, but I do find it kind of funny that the big bad event of Jujutsu Kaisen is just called the merger, as if that's not just something that companies do on a regular basis. What's next if the merger doesn't come to fruition? The acquisition? Our next forgotten detail is a forgotten parallel that I think will become relevant in the very next chapter. Way back in the Hidden Inventories arc, there was a moment where Gojo got stabbed through the chest by Toji before being vigorously cut up. After Gojo learned reverse curse technique and healed himself, he rematched Toji, telling him that he should have stabbed Gojo in the head or beheaded him rather than cutting him up in the way he did, as reverse curse technique comes from the head and beheading is a much more secure way to kill someone off. Because Toji didn't do this, he ultimately lost his life. Flash forward to chapter 251, which ends with Maki stabbing Sukuna in the chest in a direct parallel to what Toji did. Not only is the sorcerer with no cursed energy stabbing the strongest sorcerer at the time, it's also framed in the same exact way from a paneling perspective as well, and both were considered sneak attacks by the person performing it, and both stabs were done when the opponent was in a weakened or tired state. All of this leads me to believe that Toji's failure to kill Gojo in the Hidden Inventories arc is some sort of sick and twisted foreshadowing that Maki will now fail to kill Sukuna. Will Sukuna get an awakening like Gojo did? I sure hope not, but I guess it's not out of the question. Now I want to take a second to talk about something bigger than just forgotten details. Forgotten characters. There are a number of characters that have just kind of blipped out of existence through Jujutsu Kaisen. Some are completely unimportant, but there are 4 that I want to talk about because I think they might still have a role in the story. The first one I want to mention is Mio, aka Sumo Guy. The main reason I think Mio still has a role in the story is because I think his sumo ring is the reason that everyone at Jujutsu Tech Tokyo is so much stronger than they were a few months ago. This hasn't been confirmed, but I really can't think of any other way that they all got so strong besides this knockoff hyperbolic time chamber. He could potentially join the fight against Sukuna, but I think our next person is much more likely to do that because it's Daido, aka Katana Man. Katana Man seems to be a character very similar to Maki and Toji, as he does not have any cursed energy, instead having immense physical strength and skill with the sword. But we don't know if this is because he has some sort of heavenly restriction or if he's just truly goated with it. If I'm being honest, this is one of the characters that I don't totally expect to see again, but if Mio makes an appearance, it could happen for him too. He does love katanas and he does love fighting, so maybe if Yuta is killed by Sukuna, he'll come and pick up his katana and fight alongside Maki again. Another unlikely character that could return is Uro. I've recently seen an increase in theories online about Uro getting involved in this fight, but not against Sukuna. Instead, she will assist Hikari against Uraume. I'm not sure how realistic this theory is, but I don't think it's completely out of the question either if people like Charles are making an effort to beat Sukuna. Her ability could definitely help Hikari avoid attacks and potentially disrupt Uraume's attacks in general. But of the 4 characters we're talking about, I think she's definitely the least likely to return. So let's move on to the next. Todo. Where is he? Like, we saw him lay down in Shibuya and we just haven't seen him since. He hasn't ever been acknowledged or even mentioned, which is just crazy to me. Because he has been so absent, I don't think it's likely that he'll make a comeback, especially if he hasn't regrown his hand. But I still wanted to mention him because he is Todo and he definitely deserves to come back. Okay, let's get back to details, and the next one is probably the biggest one, as the next detail is one of the biggest remaining questions in Jujutsu Kaisen, the nature of Sukuna's fire arrow. But before we get into that, please consider subscribing. I'll keep it short. Subscribing is the best way to support this channel aside from viewing, and it also helps my self-esteem. So if you care about either of those things, please subscribe. You could argue that the fire arrow isn't really a detail to the viewers because so many manga readers and now anime watchers have been hyper-focused on it since it first appeared, but it does kind of feel like one of the things Gege forgot about. I mean, the fire arrow seems like such an important attack, and the secrecy around it seems to support that. Yet despite its importance, it hasn't even been acknowledged by Sukuna since Shibuya. It's especially weird considering how liberally Sukuna used it back then. Like, why use it against Jogo and Maharaga but then not against stronger opponents like Gojo or even Yuta and Yuji? It probably could have been very helpful to get him out of the corner that he was stuck in. Really, the only reminder that it still exists is this one line from Kusakabe, which implies that it's still around, but it's still bizarre that it hasn't made a comeback yet. I definitely think it's one of those details that will come back. In fact, I think out of all the details we're talking about today, this one is the most likely to be seen again. It's just too important and too hyped up to not make a return. Plus, it's really the only trick that Sukuna has up his sleeve at this point, which makes it even more likely that he has to use it. Our next detail is also a super important detail because it's Yuta's humanity. Yuta and humanity has been a running motif since Jujutsu Kaisen 0, but the most recent mentions of his humanity come in the discussion of strength. The first time it's mentioned in this context is by Ryu, who says the student is too soft and that Yuta preserving his humanity is holding him back from reaching the strengths of those like Gojo and Sukuna. This was nothing more than an interesting thought at the time, but it became a lot more interesting when Hikari mentioned it too, after Uraume commended the expelled student for his ruthlessness and lack of humanity. Hikari says that Yuta mentioned the same thing about him, bringing him back into the discussion about humanity. This scene almost makes it seem like Yuta considers his inability to forgo his humanity a weakness, which might be a feeling he developed from his conversation with Ryu. This leads me to believe that Yuta losing his humanity may be the key to a power-up of some sort for him. Especially now that he's been bisected by the slash that cuts the world, it seems really likely that Yuta will either shed his humanity or find some way to maintain it and simultaneously become stronger. This is also interesting because Yuta and Sukuna have a lot of contrasting ideologies. Their ideals on love are strongly opposing, as are their positions on humanity and their ideals behind Jujutsu as well. I think Yuta growing stronger via humanity rather than by discarding it would make a lot of sense for his character, but discarding it would also make sense anyway as well. Regardless, I don't think we're quite done seeing Yuta and humanity as a motif for the second strongest bisected sorcerer. The next detail is one that I definitely think Gege forgot. Why was Miwa in Sendai? Like, she was just there in the most dangerous colony in the Culling Games for one panel, all while she couldn't even swing her sword, and it has just never been acknowledged. I feel like Gege originally wanted to spend a bit of time on Miwa in the Culling Games, which is why she was there, but the content was cut for whatever reason. My guess is maybe she was supposed to be the focus of the Sakurajima colony instead of Maki, so Miwa wasn't actually in Sendai, it was the transition to Sakurajima. But as the story went on, Gege decided to change the focus to Maki for one reason or another. I think it's also possible that there were originally supposed to be more colonies than just the 4 we saw, but they got cut after the reception to the Culling Games was underwhelming compared to prior arcs. This could mean that Miwa was supposed to have her very own colony, but that feels like a bit of a stretch. As much as I would love to see Miwa mess up a colony, I feel like it would be used to kill her off rather than give her the spotlight because she doesn't really have a purpose in the story now. The only other reason that she was in Sendai that I can see is that she was supposed to act as a messenger for Yuta or something similar. Maybe she could switch between colonies for some reason, I don't know. This is one of those details that I don't think we'll ever get a conclusion on, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. We only have 3 details left, but these 3 are probably the most relevant and most important, like Megumi being the Zenin clan head. This detail was covered briefly after Shibuya, but was largely pushed under the rug after Maki massacred the Zenin clan. The massacre made it seem like Megumi being the clan head was ultimately insignificant, as there was no longer a clan for him to be the head of, but I don't think that's the case. Once all of this conflict is over and Sukuna and the merger are defeated, Jujutsu Society will have to rebuild. The entire landscape of Jujutsu will be drastically changed, with Gojo and the rest of the special grades dead, as well as the elders that were previously in charge. But one fixture of the old Jujutsu Society will persist: the clans. The Gojo clan is still around, even if Gojo isn't. Same with the Kamo clan, who hasn't really suffered any major losses. This likely means that a fight for power within the big 3 clans will commence, and with Megumi holding one of the most powerful techniques in Jujutsu, he would probably hold a central role in redefining Jujutsu Society. Now, this obviously assumes that Megumi will get out of Sukuna and will survive, but I don't think that's a huge assumption to make. Megumi surviving feels like the most likely path for Jujutsu Kaisen to go, and even if he becomes a one-man clan, that one man would likely become the strongest sorcerer in Jujutsu Society, aside from maybe Yuji, depending on what happens. But if I'm being honest, I don't think any of this would happen in the core Jujutsu Kaisen series, but maybe in like a spin-off or a sequel or something. Speaking of sequels, the penultimate detail also has some high potential for a sequel. Back in season 1, Gojo mentioned that there is a tidal wave of power coming in Jujutsu, and there's nothing that the higher-ups can do to stop it. This wave of power hasn't really come to fruition in Jujutsu Kaisen yet, and honestly, it doesn't seem too likely that it will, considering a lot of the sorcerers that were mentioned aren't in great condition anymore. But that doesn't mean it 100% won't happen. If Jujutsu Kaisen gets a sequel, which I kind of hope it doesn't, then I could see this tidal wave hitting the world of Jujutsu. It's also possible that this tidal wave is gone now that Gojo is dead and the world of Jujutsu does not need to balance for him anymore, but considering Sukuna is around now and the merger beast is likely to appear as well, power is still increasing. And now we come to the last and undoubtedly most important detail. It's Megumi's request for Yuji to save him. This is made in the aftermath of the Shibuya incident when Yuji is feeling extremely guilty over what Sukuna did. In the context of this moment, it's really just Megumi asking Yuji to enter the Culling Games to help him. But now, things have changed a good amount, and Megumi definitely needs saving. This line was extremely important to Yuji as it helped pull him out of his funk, and considering his last attempt to wake up Megumi was unsuccessful, I think Yuji could use this line to pull Megumi out of Sukuna, as he would literally be saving Megumi in that case. A callback to this line could make Megumi take a second to breathe and realize that his failure to suppress Sukuna will put a lot of people in danger, as if it hasn't already, but I digress. Saving Megumi is the final major plot point that the students have set out for themselves, and it has to happen in some way. I think a callback to this scene is a highly likely resolution to saving Megumi, if he doesn't die first. That's the thing about Jujutsu Kaisen, characters will just die before anything important happens to them. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to subscribe, and maybe also join the Discord. I'll see you again next week for another video.